Hi everybody, Dennis here again. Welcome back to the new and improved bindery. I thought I'd break in the new bench with a relatively simple project, but first let me show you something. I saw this piece in an antique shop and it really caught my eye. Then when I figured out what exactly it was, I was really interested. What it is a removable book cover. It slips on over the covers of a book, probably as an added level of protection, though I guess it could also serve to hide whatever it is that you're reading. I really don't have any idea how old it is, but it's obviously quite vintage. It's got some wear and tear along the spine. But it is made of leather and it's got these great embossed designs on it. I'm guessing they were made with some carved blocks that were impressed directly into the leather. On the inside it's got this fancy silk lining, and there's also this integral bookmark. That's a nice touch as well. As for how it's made, it's pretty simple. There's just 3 pieces of leather that are punched all the way around the perimeter and stitched on with this thin lacing. As for what this originally was used for, I'm not certain, although the central motif might give a bit of a clue. To me it looks like a group of choir boys, so maybe this was a cover for a hymnal or something of that nature. But for me though, I think it'd make a great cover for something like a diary or a journal, or even a sketchbook. The kind where you finish filling up all the pages and then you can just switch out the text block for a new one. And of course, I think it would be nice if those inserts were made in such a way that when you were done with them, they could then be bound for posterity. For now, what I'd like to do would be actually bind up a couple of blank books to use for this cover. All right, let's get some paper and get started. Because this cover is a bit of an odd size, I'm going to break down some larger size paper for the pages. Sketch pads are an easy source of large format paper, but the glued edge can sometimes be a bit of a pain. Rather than tear off individual sheets, I'm going to just trim off that entire end of the pad. And since this paper won't fit as is into any of my cutters, I'll need to get it down to size by hand. First, I'll split one sheet at a time in half down the middle. When doing this, it's more important that the knife be flexible than sharp. Sharpness helps, but the blade needs to be flat between the 2 layers of paper to keep it from wandering out of the fold. In fact, if you want to go for a rough-edged look, you could use a bone folder instead of a knife. I'm really liking this new setup so far, by the way. At this workstation, I can use the wall to line up the edges of the paper for folding, which is handy, especially if you're like me and your eyesight isn't what it used to be. Anyway, for now I'll keep those sheets in pairs while I break down a few more. Back on the new bench, I don't have a handy wall at this end, but a brick and a ruler can serve the same purpose. I put the ruler there because otherwise the paper tends to slip down under the edge of the brick. These pieces need to be cut into 3, and the easiest way I've found to do that is to cut a piece of card that's 1/3 the length of the paper. Using that as a guide, I can fold and cut away exactly 1/3 of the sheet. With that done, I can then simply fold and cut what remains in half as normal. I'm cutting 2 pieces at a time here, by the way, so that means that a single sheet from the original sketch pad will yield 6 smaller sheets, which conveniently makes for a single signature for the book. Another way to bring those split sheets down to size is with a guillotine. It has its pros and cons, but I'll discuss those in a bit. Here I'm putting a bit of scrap gray board in first, as my cutter has a habit of not getting through the last couple of sheets no matter how hard I squeeze. I suspect it needs a bit of a tune-up. Once I get the paper in place and clamped down though, it makes short work of it. I put both the cut and uncut pieces back in for the second trim. I got the measurement pretty much bang on this time, but if it was a bit off, I could adjust the fence to trim 1 millimeter or so off the whole lot. Speed is the big selling point for using a guillotine, but the trade-off from my hand splitting technique is that I now have to count out the sheets for the signatures. I haven't timed it, but I suspect that for just 1 or 2 books, the hand method is probably faster. Now let's see just how thick of a text block I can fit into this cover. That seems a bit much. Better to have too few than too many in this case, so I'll go with 10. I folded enough paper for 3 books, but before I get to sewing, I think I'll put them all into the press for a while to flatten out. I know that at the beginning I said I was going to make up several books, but while those were in the press, I decided to do just one for now, and I'll save these other signatures for another video. In part that's because these are a bit too tall to fit into the old cover. For now, I'll just trim this group to size, and then I can use the others for some other projects later. Some people in the comments have asked me what I do with all of my offcuts, and the answer is, I'm saving them. Hopefully by the time the weather warms up, I'll have enough to try my hand at paper making. Next, I'll cut down some heavyweight paper for the covers. This is 160 GSM, I believe. I'm going to be doing a slight variation on the sewn board binding to adapt it as a blank book insert. I know I haven't shown that style of binding on the channel before, so we'll consider this a soft introduction for now. But it might make for a good next installment in the beginners series, so let me know down in the comments if that's something you'd like to see. For now, I need 2 pieces that are a little more than double the width of the book. And of course I need to add in some of my own marbled paper for the end papers. But I'm going to keep it simple this time and skip the burnishing. Cheap and cheerful is the way to go today, as they say. It doesn't always have to be complicated. Each piece for the covers gets 2 creases, one at the width of the book, which is where it'll be sewn, and then another to form a flap that's about 1 inch wide. You'll see the reason for that a bit later. The defining characteristic of this binding style is that the covers are sewn directly into the book. So I'll start by piercing the sewing holes in the heavyweight paper before carrying on with the rest of the signatures. I'll skip the marbled sheets though, as those will get tipped in with glue later. The sewing is relatively simple, no support cords or sewing frame necessary. I'll just wax some linen thread and get started by sewing the first cover all along. From the second signature onward, I do what's called a French link stitch by passing the needle under the sewing of the previous signature. This is an easy way to lend a bit of support to the sewing without the need for cords or tapes. When I first started bookbinding, I had no end of trouble managing my thread. I somehow didn't understand that lengths of thread could be joined, and so I got myself into countless tangles trying to wrestle miles of the stuff. Learning this weaver's knot made my life so much simpler. I made a short video on how to tie it, so if you're in a similar situation to where I was, do check it out. I'll finish off by sewing on the other cover, and then I'll secure it with a double kettle stitch. That turned out great. I really do like the look of this link stitch. The other thing I like is that we're almost done. I just need to get these end papers tipped in and the spine glued up and lined, and that's about it. For today's waste paper, we have a discarded book. I believe this one is an obsolete SAT study guide. For my purposes, it's a handy pad of glue barriers that would otherwise have found its way into the bin, so I think it's a good use for it. And I know my glue container says mix, but I just poured in the last of the glue from the bottle, so it's pretty much straight PVA in there. I only need a thin line of it along the spine edge of the end papers to get them tipped into the book. To glue out the spine, I'll get the book lined up in the laying press. As always, I like to push the sewing holes closed to keep the glue from seeping down between the pages. This might be unnecessary as the book's clamped up pretty tight and I'm going to work the glue down into the signatures anyway, but it can't do any harm, I guess. It's just something I've always done. I follow up the glue with some thin Japanese tissue. I work that down well and try to push it down into the grooves between the signatures with my bone folder. I think this release paper has been used one too many times as it's not actually releasing that well. No harm though, as I'm going to add a little bit more glue anyway, and then fold the tissue paper over for another layer. Hopefully that'll add a bit more resilience to the spine without significantly increasing the bulk. Finally, I'll just trim off the excess and I'll leave it to dry for a few hours. From the start, my idea was to make a book block insert that was just partially bound. The slip-on cover will provide most of the protection while it gets used, and then someday down the road it could be trimmed if necessary and then given a cover treatment. But in the meantime, these little flaps are there to give a little bit more protection. The outer leaves of the end papers get tucked in under the flaps, and these are what will be inserted into the pockets of the leather cover. That way, when you open the book, you'll still see the decoration on the inside just like a typical book, but the delicate edges and corners of the marbled paper won't get bruised and crumpled by the cover. That's the theory, at least. Let's see how it works out in practice. Well, I really like the way that turned out. I really do enjoy the casual, inviting feel of a softcover notebook. Something about how it just seems to flex and adapt to whatever you need it to be. The minimal lining on the spine means that the book opens really well, which is just what you want in a journal or sketchbook. Overall, that was a fun little project. It was a great way for me to try out the new reorganized bindery, and I hope you found something worthwhile in it as well. If you did, then please do hit the like button and perhaps consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. We've built an amazing community of viewers here, so it would be great if you could become a part of it. As always, I truly appreciate you spending your time with me, so thank you, and I'll see you next time.